The warm glow of chandeliers bathed La Fontaine in golden light, casting soft reflections on the polished marble floors. The air was thick with sophistication, the clinking of glasses harmonizing with the faint murmur of jazz from the grand piano in the corner. It was the kind of place where the wealthy came to indulge, where business deals were sealed over top-shelf scotch, and where the hum of privilege was as much a part of the atmosphere as the fragrance of imported wine. Moving seamlessly through the opulence was Deborah, a young waitress whose presence often went unnoticed among the neatly pressed suits and glittering jewelry. At 25, she carried herself with quiet grace, balancing trays and forced smiles with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate spaces where she was seen but never truly acknowledged. To most patrons, she was just another server. But beneath the uniform, beneath the polite nods and whispered, "Enjoy your meal," lived a dream far greater than this restaurant could ever contain. Music was Deborah's true calling. It had been since the first time her fingers brushed against the worn keys of the old, upright piano in her childhood home. The piano had been her refuge, her escape from a world that often felt too heavy. Growing up in South Carolina, she had spent countless nights teaching herself to play, mimicking the melodies from her mother's old vinyl records, pouring every ounce of emotion into the keys. Church halls, school recitals, community centers, those had been her first stages. But life had a way of forcing dreams onto the back burner. Bills needed to be paid, responsibilities couldn't be ignored. And so the music that once filled her days had been reduced to stolen moments in the back room of La Fontaine, where an old, out-of-tune piano waited for her between shifts. That Friday night, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual blend of laughter and indulgence, Deborah kept her head down and her hands busy. She moved between tables, clearing plates, refilling glasses, responding to the occasional impatient wave of a patron who barely looked her in the eye. It was just another night, another shift, another few hours standing between her and the quiet solitude of home. Then the doors swung open, and in walked Leonard Grayson. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed the world existed for his amusement. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his presence commanded attention without effort. Those who recognized him straightened instinctively, aware of his reputation, a man whose fortune had been built on ruthless ambition, whose name carried weight in elite circles. To Leonard, people were accessories, existing either to serve his interests or to be ignored entirely. Deborah barely glanced up as she carried a tray past his table, but she felt it. The way his eyes lingered on her, a spark of amusement flashing across his face. She had served men like him before, men who thrived on the discomfort of others, who found entertainment in making those beneath them squirm. Still, she kept her posture steady, her expression neutral. But Leonard wasn't one to be ignored. And tonight, he had already decided she would be his entertainment. What neither of them knew was that the game he was about to play would not end the way he expected. Leonard Grayson settled into his seat with the air of a man who owned the world. The plush leather chair molded to his frame as he leaned back, his fingers drumming idly against the polished mahogany table. His entrance had already stirred the room. Conversations had dipped into hushed tones, eyes had flickered toward him, some admiring, others wary. He was used to it, he expected it. After all, he wasn't just another wealthy patron at La Fontaine. He was Leonard Grayson, and his presence alone dictated the energy of any room he entered. Across the restaurant, Deborah wove through the tables, balancing plates with quiet efficiency. She had felt his gaze the moment he arrived, that almost imperceptible shift in the air when someone powerful sets their sights on you. It wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Amusement. Amusement and the simmering thrill of a game only he knew the rules to. Leonard had always enjoyed a spectacle, especially when he was the one pulling the strings. His reputation preceded him, a businessman with a ruthless streak, a man whose wealth bought him access to the highest levels of power and privilege. But more than anything, Leonard thrived on control. He took particular pleasure in unsettling people, watching them squirm under the weight of his attention. And tonight, as his sharp eyes followed Deborah's every move, he had already decided she would be his next amusement. He let the evening play out, sipping his drink, engaging in lively conversation with his entourage, but always keeping Deborah in his periphery. She moved with a quiet grace, her posture composed despite the endless demands of her shift. There was something about her that intrigued him. She wasn't just another waitress scurrying between tables, eager to fade into the background. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, an inner world he could sense but not yet see. And that was exactly what made her interesting. Deborah was used to difficult customers, to the entitled glances and condescending smiles, but Leonard's attention was different. It was deliberate, calculated, a slow, simmering trap that she could feel tightening around her before she even had time to place a name to it. Then, just as she was refilling the wine glasses at his table, he spoke. "Deborah, huh?" His voice was smooth, laced with the kind of casual authority that made it clear he was used to being listened to. Sounds like someone with hidden talents. The way he said it sent a chill down her spine, not because of the words themselves, but because of the weight they carried. He wasn't just making conversation, he was toying with her. She forced a polite smile. "Just here to work, sir. Can I get you anything else?" Leonard smirked, leaning back in his chair, studying her like a cat watching a cornered mouse. "Oh, I think you've got more to offer than just carrying plates." His companions chuckled, their laughter low and knowing. Deborah's grip on the tray tightened, but she didn't falter. She had dealt with men like him before, men who mistook their wealth for charm, who believed the world existed to cater to their amusement. But Leonard wasn't done, not yet. He took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down with deliberate ease. "You know," he mused, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, "I've always believed talent can be found in the most unexpected places, and I have a feeling you're not just a waitress." Deborah's pulse quickened. She had no idea where this was going, but she didn't like it. Leonard gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the restaurant, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light. "What do you say, Deborah? Why don't you entertain us with a little performance?" The word sent a shockwave through her. The restaurant grew noticeably quieter as nearby diners turned their heads, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't making a kind offer, he was setting a trap. Deborah's mouth went dry. She had spent years hiding her talent behind the demands of survival, keeping her passion tucked away in the quiet corners of her life, where no one could touch it. And now, this man, this arrogant, insufferable man, was trying to turn it into a spectacle for his own amusement. She opened her mouth to decline, but Leonard was already shaking his head, clicking his tongue in mock disappointment. "Oh, come on. What's the harm? A little music never hurt anyone." More eyes turned toward her. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down, the silent judgment waiting to unfold. If she refused, she would be the girl who backed down, the girl who wasn't worth the effort. And that was exactly what Leonard wanted. She took a slow breath, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." Leonard smirked, leaning back with the air of a man who had already won. "What do you say? Or is all that talk just for show?" Something inside Deborah snapped. She set down the tray with careful precision, straightened her shoulders, and met Leonard's gaze head-on. The corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly, not in amusement, but in defiance. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll play." The room bristled with anticipation as she turned toward the piano, each step measured, deliberate. The challenge had been issued. The stage was set. What Leonard didn't know was that the moment she touched those keys, he wouldn't be the one in control anymore. Deborah felt the weight of Leonard Grayson's gaze before she even turned around. There was something predatory in the way he watched her, his smirk lingering as if he were already enjoying some private joke at her expense. She had dealt with difficult customers before, men who assumed their wealth granted them the right to condescend. But this was different. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a game, and she had just become the unwilling participant. Balancing a tray of empty glasses, Deborah approached his table, keeping her posture straight and her expression neutral. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations, silverware clinking against porcelain, but at Leonard's table there was an air of expectancy. His companions, equally polished in designer suits and glittering dresses, watched her with thinly veiled amusement. They were waiting for something. Waiting for him. Leonard leaned back in his chair, his crystal tumbler of scotch resting lazily in one hand. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice smooth yet carrying the unmistakable edge of condescension. "What do you do when you're not waiting tables? Surely a young woman like you has aspirations." Deborah stiffened. She knew this type of conversation. It was never about genuine curiosity. It was about control, about making her uncomfortable for the sake of his own entertainment. Still, she refused to let him see her flinch. "I play piano," she answered, keeping her voice even. "When I have time." Leonard's eyes gleamed. "A pianist," he mused, feigning surprise. "Well, now that is unexpected." He turned to his companions, shaking his head in mock admiration. "Isn't it wonderful, a hidden talent among us?" His entourage chuckled, their laughter dripping with something that wasn't quite kindness. Deborah forced a tight smile and began to step away, but Leonard wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, tapping his tumbler against the table, "there's a grand piano right over there." He gestured toward the glossy black instrument in the corner of the restaurant, its polished surface reflecting the golden glow of the chandeliers. "Why don't you give us a little performance? Show us what you've got." The air shifted. Conversations at nearby tables faltered as diners turned to watch. Deborah's stomach clenched. She wasn't some street performer to be summoned at will. And yet, Leonard had set the stage perfectly. If she declined, it would only feed into his narrative that she was either too timid or not talented enough to perform. If she agreed, she would be playing for his amusement, like a trained animal on command. She hesitated. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm working right now. Maybe another time." Leonard skied, shaking his head. "Come now, don't be modest. A real musician doesn't need an invitation. They seize the moment." His companions murmured in agreement, smirks playing on their lips. Deborah's grip tightened on the tray. This was exactly what he wanted, to put her in a position where no answer would be good enough. Leonard leaned forward, his smirk widening. "Or maybe," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make sure she heard it, "you're just not as good as you think you are." A sharp, knowing laugh from one of his companions sent heat rising in Deborah's chest. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was about proving something to them, to herself. She had spent years letting her dreams wait, letting her talent sit in the shadows while she worked to survive. But not tonight. She inhaled deeply, meeting Leonard's gaze head-on. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll play." Leonard's smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. He hadn't expected her to take the bait, but it didn't matter. As Deborah walked toward the piano, the quiet murmur of the restaurant faded into a hush. All eyes were on her. She wasn't playing for Leonard. She wasn't playing for anyone but herself. A hush fell over the restaurant as Deborah approached the grand piano. The weight of every gaze pressed against her back, heavy with expectation, curiosity, and, in some cases, skepticism. The polished black surface of the instrument gleamed under the warm chandelier light, its ivory keys waiting. She slid onto the bench, exhaling softly, her fingers hovering just above the keys. Behind her, Leonard Grayson leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk stretching across his face. He thought he had won. He believed this was a spectacle of his own making, a game he controlled. To him, Deborah was just another person caught in his web, another name he would forget by the end of the night. The restaurant patrons watched, some intrigued, others merely expecting another moment of entertainment to pair with their expensive wine. Deborah closed her eyes for a brief moment, grounding herself. The weight of the evening, the taunts, the quiet humiliation, it all melted away. All that remained was the piano and the music waiting inside her. With a deep breath, she let her hands fall, and the first notes rang through the air. Soft at first, like the delicate steps of a dancer, the melody unfurled in the room, weaving itself into every corner. She had chosen Clair de Lune, a piece of ethereal beauty, one that required precision, grace, and an understanding of emotion deeper than the notes on a page. The sound was light as silk, each note cascading into the next like ripples across still water. The restaurant held its breath. The initial hum of murmured conversations faded, the clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased. Even the bartenders paused in their motions, their hands frozen over cocktail shakers. Deborah was no longer just a waitress at La Fontaine. In that moment, she was the artist she had always been, her fingers moving with a confidence that came from years of unspoken dedication. Leonard's smirk slowly faltered. His glass of scotch sat untouched in his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly as the reality of what was unfolding before him took shape. This wasn't the hesitant, awkward performance he had anticipated. This wasn't someone cowering under the weight of his challenge. This was mastery. This was power. As Deborah played, she lost herself in the music. The restaurant, the diners, Leonard's condescension, all of it faded into the background. She let the piece swell, her fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys, coaxing out every emotion embedded in the melody. The sorrow, the longing, the quiet defiance, it was all there, stitched into the fabric of the music. A sharp intake of breath from someone in the audience broke the silence. A woman near the bar pressed a hand to her chest, eyes shining. At a nearby table, an older man, who had barely paid attention to his meal, sat in stunned reverence. Even the other waitstaff, who had grown accustomed to Leonard's theatrics, were motionless, their usual hurried movements forgotten. And then, as the last note lingered in the air, fading into silence, the moment stretched. For a few precious seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, like a thunderclap, applause erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was thunderous. Some patrons rose to their feet, hands meeting with an energy that sent vibrations through the room. A woman dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a napkin, her expression one of quiet awe. Deborah, still seated at the piano, blinked, momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected this. From behind her, Leonard sat frozen. The air of smug confidence that had surrounded him all evening had vanished. His fingers tapped against his tumbler, his posture rigid. The attention was no longer on him, and for a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, the shift was palpable. He forced a slow, deliberate clap. It was measured, hollow, a poor attempt to regain control of a moment that had completely slipped from his grasp. But no one was watching him anymore. Deborah rose from the bench, feeling a newfound steadiness in her steps. As she turned, she met Leonard's gaze head-on. The power dynamic between them had shifted, and they both knew it. "Unexpected," Leonard finally said, his voice louder than necessary, a weak attempt to reclaim his presence in the room. "I suppose talent can come from the most surprising places." His entourage chuckled uneasily, unsure of whether to join in on his attempt at regaining dominance. Deborah tilted her head slightly, considering him. She could have responded with bitterness, with anger, with the very humiliation he had tried to force upon her. Instead, she simply nodded. "Everyone has a gift," she said, her tone even, unwavering. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." Leonard stiffened ever so slightly. The words had landed exactly where she intended them to. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. The restaurant remained charged with the aftershock of the moment. As Deborah made her way back to the waitstaff station, a few patrons stopped her, their words filled with admiration. A gentleman near the bar extended his hand, slipping a crisp bill into her palm with a murmured thank you. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone they would remember. The moment Deborah struck the final note, the air inside La Fontaine was thick with stunned silence. The last vibrations of the piano keys lingered, filling the space where laughter and condescension had once reigned. For the first time that night, Leonard Grayson had nothing to say. Then, as if a collective breath had been released, the room erupted into applause. It was not the polite, obligatory clapping that often followed background music in high-end restaurants. It was thunderous, raw, and charged with admiration. Patrons who had been sipping wine absent-mindedly now stood, hands meeting in resounding appreciation. Some whistled, others exchanged looks of awe, and a few, deeply moved, dabbed at their eyes. Deborah remained seated at the piano bench, her fingers still resting on the keys, as if hesitant to break the moment. Her heart pounded, but it was no longer from anxiety. It was something else, a sense of power, of affirmation, of knowing she had reclaimed a part of herself. At the center of it all, Leonard sat frozen. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite define: shock, embarrassment, maybe even something close to regret. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and forced a tight, awkward chuckle. as though attempting to mask his discomfort. "Well," he said, his voice slightly strained, "I suppose talent really does come from the most unexpected places." It was meant to sound magnanimous, an attempt to reclaim authority over the situation, but it fell flat. The statement hung in the air, empty and unconvincing. His entourage, once eager to echo his every word, now exchanged uncertain glances. They had witnessed something undeniable, a moment where Leonard's power had been stripped away, not through force, but through sheer, undeniable talent. Deborah turned toward him, standing slowly. She met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "Thank you," she said, her voice smooth and composed. There was no arrogance in her tone, no malice, but also no attempt to make him comfortable. Something about her poise unsettled Leonard further. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but found nothing to say. A woman from a nearby table, a longtime patron of La Fontaine, leaned toward Leonard's table with a knowing smile. "It seems you were expecting to humiliate her, Mr. Grayson," she said pleasantly. "Instead, you just gave us the best performance we've ever had here." Chuckles rippled through the room. Leonard tensed. This was not how he had imagined the night unfolding. He was used to being the orchestrator, the man who dictated the atmosphere in any room he entered. But now, the balance had shifted, and he was left exposed. A waiter passed Deborah as she stepped away from the piano. "That was incredible," he whispered, giving her an encouraging nod. She smiled at him before heading back toward her station, but something had changed. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. The way people looked at her had shifted from someone they overlooked to someone they truly saw. Leonard downed the rest of his drink in one go and placed his glass down with a loud clink. "Let's go," he muttered to his companions. His usual grand exit, the kind that drew attention, had been reduced to a quiet retreat. He pulled a few crisp bills from his wallet, barely making eye contact with the server who brought his check. As his group filed out, the applause had not yet fully faded. Deborah didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. She had already won in the way that mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, Leonard Grayson had been rendered completely, undeniably speechless. As Leonard Grayson and his entourage slipped out of the restaurant, the atmosphere inside La Fontaine remained charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. The usual quiet murmur of fine dining had been replaced by something else, something richer, more meaningful. Patrons who had spent the evening focused on their own conversations now found themselves glancing toward Deborah with newfound admiration. It wasn't just about her music. It was about the way she had carried herself, the quiet dignity with which she had accepted Leonard's challenge, and the grace with which she had turned the moment into something far greater than a mere performance. She had walked into that dining room as just another waitress, a face in the background, but now she was the person everyone was talking about. As she returned to her usual duties, a few diners stopped her not with the usual requests for wine refills or menu recommendations, but with words of genuine appreciation. "That was breathtaking," an older woman said, her voice warm with sincerity. "You have a gift, my dear, a real gift." Another man dressed in an expensive navy suit nodded as she passed. "I don't know much about music, but I know when I've witnessed something special." Even the staff saw her differently. A fellow waiter, who had worked alongside her for months but had never paid much attention beyond the day-to-day tasks, met her eyes with a quiet nod of respect. The restaurant manager, usually too busy checking on guests to acknowledge the waitstaff individually, pulled her aside for a brief moment. "I had no idea," he admitted, shaking his head. "That was remarkable." But perhaps the most telling shift was in the way people no longer looked through her. Before, she had been invisible, a background figure in a place designed to cater to the elite. Now, she had become someone worth noticing, not because of wealth or status, but because she had proven something that no amount of money could buy. And the irony was clear. Leonard Grayson, a man who had spent his entire life making sure the world saw him, had been overshadowed by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. Deborah, however, wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. She wasn't even dwelling on the applause or the praise. As she moved through the restaurant, she felt something settle deep within her, something unshakable. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, As the night at La Fontaine slowly wound down, Deborah remained composed, though her heart still raced with the echoes of her performance. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in, but something inside her had shifted. She had walked into work expecting another routine shift, serving tables, clearing plates, fading into the background, but she was leaving with something far greater than a paycheck. A few days later, word of her impromptu performance had traveled beyond the restaurant walls. Patrons who had witnessed the moment spoke about it to friends, and soon, whispers of the waitress with a pianist's soul spread. Then, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, as she was wrapping up a shift, a gentleman approached her, an older man with an easy smile and sharp eyes, someone who had been quietly observing from the corner that night. He slid a business card onto the counter and met her gaze. "I heard your music the other night," he said, his voice calm but purposeful, "and I think the world needs to hear more of it." Deborah glanced at the card. A music producer. A long pause settled between them. She could feel the hesitation creeping in, the familiar voice of doubt, whispering that this was too good to be true. But then she remembered the way she had felt at the piano, uninhibited, powerful, completely herself. For the first time in years, the door to her dream stood open. And this time, she wasn't afraid to walk through it. Deborah's story is more than just a moment of triumph. It is a reminder that true power lies in knowing your worth. She could have backed down, let humiliation silence her, allowed someone like Leonard Grayson to define her. But she chose differently. She chose to stand tall, to let her talent speak louder than words, and in doing so, she changed the way everyone in that room saw her, including herself. How often do we allow fear, doubt, or the judgment of others to keep us from stepping into our potential? How many dreams have been left behind because someone convinced us we weren't good enough? Deborah's story challenges us to ask ourselves, what would happen if we stopped waiting for permission and simply believed in our own greatness? You don't need the approval of the world to pursue what sets your soul on fire. You just need the courage to take that first step. If Deborah's story inspired you, comment 1 below. If you think we can improve, comment 2. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more stories of resilience, strength, and the undeniable power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next inspiring story.